This is Duke University.
We are very privileged for our luncheon speaker to have an old friend of mine. Not that we don't like using the word old too much with ourselves, but it's out of the bag, so to speak. Matt Owens has a very unusual background and has had a very interesting career. He retired from the Marine Corps as a colonel in 1994, but he also has his PhD in politics from the University of Dallas, and he's been a professor for many years at the U.S. Naval War College. You have probably read his many op-eds, his many publications. He is an editor of Orbis, which, as you may know, is the publication of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and I'm on the board of advisors. Really great institution. But he's also been very interested in the subject of civil-military relations. And he's just published a new book on that subject, U.S. Civil-Military Relations After 9/11, Renegotiating the Civil-Military Bargain. I think you're going to find his presentation not just interesting, but provocative, and we look forward to having some time for Q&A. Mac, thank you so much for coming to our conference.
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm delighted, honored to be here, to have gotten this invitation to be on this program with such high-powered folks. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm not saying I've known Charlie for some time. We go back a long ways, and you know, he wrote one of the seminal articles on civil-military relations. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was called the Military Coup of 2012. We're there, but I mean, it's very interesting that in this...
That was in 1992.
92. No, but it was very interesting because it's very prescient in terms of the things, the trends that he had identified, how in many respects they were coming to pass. And so, you know, that was, I think, very, very important, very influential and the like. So he's done a lot of that. And of course, those of us who know Charlie, we only wish that he didn't beat around the bush, that he really say what was on his mind. So, I mean, you understand this the situation now. Now, I confess I'm not a lawyer, okay? As a matter of fact, I further confess that I kind of bear or harbor a little resentment towards lawyers. But it's my own damn fault because my ex-wife's lawyers were better than mine.
Probably had a better pay.
Hey, could be. I want to talk about civil-military relations today, and I want to talk about civil-military relations in a way that's a little bit broader, I think, than most of us are used to looking at it. There's a definition, a couple of definitions up there, basically to say that we're talking about the interaction between the armed forces of a state and the society in which it's embedded. That it really deals with the allocation of prerogatives and authorities between the civil government and the military establishment. And one way of looking at this is to say there's two hands on the sword. The first is the civil hand, and that's the one that decides when the sword is to be drawn and for what purpose. And the military hand is the one that keeps it honed, keeps it sharp, keeps it ready to go, and then actually wields it in combat. Now, where's Peter? Peter Fever? Peter here? Okay, Peter Fever. He's another guy I don't like because he's younger, better looking, and smarter than I am. But,
and he's not better looking, although that's not saying much.
Wow. My old friend Charlie. Okay. But no, I mean, Peter has done a lot of work, very, very similar work on civil-military relations. As a matter of fact, I feel honored to do that. He's gotten tired of it, now I'm moving into it. But I mean, the fact is that, you know, he has identified, he among others, and the clearest formulation of the problem, the dilemma, he called it the problematique of civil-military relations, is that the problem is that a military can be either too strong or too weak when it comes to defending a country. On the one hand, the coercive power of the military makes it a potential, at least a potential threat to the military, to the government. But if it's too weak to do what needs to be done, then it also is a threat to that civil government. So the question becomes, how do you deal with this? What steps do you take so that you ensure that your military is strong enough to protect the government, but not too strong to overthrow it? And one of the answers, of course, came in 1957 from Samuel Huntington, his idea of objective control, in which basically the civilians grant to the military a zone of autonomy within which a highly professional officer corps stands ready to carry out the wishes of any civilian group, which secures the legitimate authority within the state. In other words, you have an apolitical military. And basically, the idea is that they stay out of politics, and the quid pro quo is the military has a certain autonomy within the preparation for war and the conduct of war itself. Cohen has called this the normal theory, and as he himself has shown, part of the problem here is that it is frequently violated, if that's the proper word. But we often do not adhere to it for the simple reason that it doesn't work. Politics and the military have to go back and forth. War is not fought for its own purpose. War is fought for the purposes of the state. Therefore, once the war is launched, you just have to step out of the way and say, okay, we'll turn it over to the generals and let them do what they want to. For the simple reason that conditions change, circumstances change, and it has to be an iterative process. So there has to be a give and take between the military and the civilians. Now, one of the things, Charlie, about a year ago, was kind enough to call this a theory. I wouldn't call this a theory. I call this a framework. My suggestion is really American civil-military relations is a bargain. It's and the goal is to allocate these prerogatives we talked about before between the civilian government and the military on the other. Now, there are three parties to the government. I mean, three parties to the bargain. I used to think there were only two, but the fact is we can't forget the American people. The American people play. They may not be involved in it on a day-to-day basis, but they have some impact. I mean, two examples, of course, are right after the Revolutionary War, there were very important people in the government, like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, who wanted a more formidable regular establishment, or at least a more formalized militia. But the American people really wouldn't stand for it. And so for a very long time, we didn't have that establishment that even these individuals thought we needed. A similar situation occurs with the issue of homosexuals in the military. If you go back to the Clinton administration, we forget that it was the Congress of the United States, a Democrat Congress, that passed the law prohibiting service by homosexuals in the military. That was the position of the American people, and that has apparently changed with the reversal of the law last year. The thing is, for whatever reason, geopolitical, technological, social, this bargain needs to be renegotiated periodically. And we have, just some examples you can look at to say periods of time when in fact this bargain was renegotiated. You can go back all back to the beginning, to the founding and so forth, but just in the 20th and 21st century, probably the biggest renegotiation was with World War II. You had another renegotiation after the Cold War with the development of nuclear weapons. With the end of the Cold War, you had the emphasis on constabulary operations that created some problems in the military. And again, Charlie talked a lot about those in his 1992 essay on the Military Coup of 2012. You can say that after 9/11, it was renegotiated again with the issue of dealing with the protracted conflict and the problems that it entails. And so the question is, what's going to happen in the future? And it depends a great deal on which way we come down. A lot of people say there will be no more Iraqs and no more Afghanistans, and that therefore the sorts of things we got, the way we did things during that period of time will perhaps slip away. We've made that argument before. We made it after Vietnam, but we weren't going to do Vietnams anymore. Okay, so we have to be a little careful with that. But the other possibility, of course, is that we move to a more high-tech standoff type of military approach. A fellow named Edward Luke back during the 1990s coined the phrase post-heroic warfare. He was a little premature then, but one of the possibilities is that maybe he's on target for the present time. I got a bunch of things here that I would say people really need to know about civil-military relations. And as I say, civil-military relations is broader than is sometimes understood as simply civilian control of the military. The first is that we've had lots of tension over the past, civil-military relations. There are just a few examples right here. Of course, everybody knows about Washington Newburgh, how he basically was able to almost diffuse what could have been a very serious mutiny on the part of his officers. Andrew, I don't know if many people might know about the situation in Florida, in Spanish Florida in 1819, when Andrew Jackson on his own basically crossed into Florida and created something of an international incident. You have the Mexican War, where you had a Democratic president, and he had Whig generals. And so he wanted to win the war. That is, James Polk wanted to win the war, but he didn't want to win it in such a way that would make his generals look too good. And of course, at the same time, they were politicking. They were criticizing his strategy from the field. Many people argue that the American Civil War, of course, is probably the greatest civil-military crisis we've faced. Not only the issue between Lincoln and McClellan, but in many other aspects as well. In the post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, you had a very dangerous situation in which, as Andrew Johnson was being impeached, his advisors were saying to call up the Army and basically suppress Congress. The whole issue basically of the preparedness movement in the before World War I, led by Teddy Roosevelt and Leonard Wood. And of course, in 1920, we talk about the politicization of the military, that in the election of 1920, Leonard Wood actually ran for the Republican nomination while in uniform, while still on active duty. So these ideas these problems are not really new. The other thing I'd point out is that civil-military relations is about far more than just civilian control. And here, there are four other things we have to worry about. What's the acceptable level of influence on the part of the military? Is there something like a militarized foreign policy? Do we have to worry about those sorts of things? What's the primary purpose of the military? Is it primarily used to fight foreign wars, or is it going to be involved in domestic affairs? You may remember after Katrina, there was a big debate on the use of the military in domestic affairs, and there's basically a great deal of argument against using it in that capacity. There's the whole idea of patterns of civil-military relations. Risa Brooks, who's now at Marquette, I believe, wrote a wonderful book on basically how these patterns will affect the outcome how civil-military patterns will affect the outcome of wars and so forth. And then finally, who serves? And of course, the biggest issue right now is going to be the implementation of the integration, and presumably of open homosexuals into the military. Although another one, a kind of interesting one based on the panel we just had, is the whole idea of recruitment and maintenance of Muslims into the U.S. military. A very small number, but the fact is that it's an issue that we'll probably be dealing with. There are other things we need to worry about. And the tendency sometimes to look at civil-military relations is involving only the executive branch. Well, Congress has some role in that as well. I always like to tell my students up at the Naval War College that ultimately the Congress is the force planner of last resort. They determine where the budget's going to be allocated and so forth, and so they have a great say in all these sorts of things. Now, this other one here is something that I felt this way for a very long time. When I first came into the debate in the 1990s, when Peter and Dick Cohen and these other folks were really heavily involved in it, my tendency was to kind of blow it off and say, well, the military's pretty much internalized the idea of civilian control, so there's not really an issue, there's not really a problem. But of course, you can look at it and you can find that just because you don't have a coup doesn't mean that there aren't some problems with your civil-military relations. Other ones, which of course we've seen in this recent sort of debates, well, going all the way back to Vietnam, but especially with the Iraq War and so forth, is that the military is not always right, even on strictly military affairs. You get plenty of examples from the Civil War, from World War II, from the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War. I mean, I'm a Vietnam guy, so it would really be great for us to blame all of our problems on what the civilians did. But the fact was that the strategy, the operational strategy we followed until about 1969 was really strictly developed by the military, by General Westmoreland and so forth, and the problems arose from that. It wasn't Lyndon Johnson, choosing bombing targets. This brings us to this whole issue of dissent. And that is that the military has the obligation to make the strongest possible argument for its position. But it does not have the right to insist that their advice be followed. And this is something we saw a bit of this with the so-called revolt of the generals back during the Bush administration. The fact is, now, it's funny, I was just talking to Peter, and Peter wrote this article. He talked about civilian supremacists versus professional supremacists. And he's actually said that maybe those terms are a little too strong, but the fact is there's a great deal of disagreement over this whole idea. The civilian supremacists basically say that the civilians have the right to be wrong. And the professional supremacists say that's one issue, but the other issue is they want to suppress what we have to say. And I think that that's an oversimplification, but that's a lot of the debate that's going on. But the fact is that you have to acknowledge that any organization, even the military, has the right to dissent, not to disobey, but to dissent. And the two things are not the same. And this raises a number of questions. You've got the whole idea of, well, is the military just another obedient bureaucracy? Or is it a profession that is granted significant autonomy and a unique role because of its professionalism and so forth, based on its knowledge and expertise? And what does the difference mean for dissent? And what options does an officer have when she disagrees with the policies, orders, and set of the civilians? This is, of course, you may recognize General Newbold. He was one of the generals who, basically, after he retired, basically was very critical of the Bush administration, but especially Secretary Rumsfeld. A lot of people, both active and retired at the time, said, that would have made a lot more sense if he said it while he was still on active duty. Okay, so that's that's another issue we have to kind of keep in mind here. You may know Dick Cohen. He's from that other school across the way, but basically he's one of the foremost, I think, experts on civil-military relations. A wonderful historian, wrote a wonderful book on the origins of the American military establishment and the like. But I won't read this to you because you can read it yourself. But this has to do with this whole idea, basically, of if military officers don't like what's going on, they should be able to simply resign and protest. Well, perhaps that in extremis that is an answer, but the fact is that this idea somehow that that's what the Joint Chiefs should have done during Vietnam is, I think, he would argue that that's misplaced. And a lot of what goes on, a lot of the problems we sometimes have is the misreading of a book by one of his students, H.R. McMaster, who wrote this book called Dereliction of Duty. And you frequently hear people argue that, well, that's what he said they should have done. But these are my own observations on H.R.'s book. And basically that, they should have openly argued their case, made their case and so forth. But he did not argue that they should have said, well, we're going to leak stuff to the press, or we're going to resign, or we're going to throw a hissy fit, or something like that. That's not the tradition of the United States military. And I have to say that when I'm, I gave a similar pitch out at the Army Commander General Staff College back in October. By the way, anybody been there? You're down on this stage, and there are 2,500 majors that disappear over the horizon. It's quite amazing. Anyway, I'm much more comfortable with a group this size. But anyway, they raise the particular questions. How do you get at the exact, how do you determine what the right step is? And I guess the answer is trite, but at some point you have to get in there and you have to argue that, well, it really depends on the circumstances. And Don Snyder, who's done a tremendous amount of work on this whole idea of the criteria that have to be examined in a decision that an officer makes about whether what to do when he or she dissents with the decision of the of civilians. This is very important to remember, I think, and that is that there's a difference between being political and being partisan. We hear all the time about the military is too political. Well, the military has to be political for all the reasons I've talked about before, because this normal theory of civil-military relations doesn't necessarily hold. You have to be able to recognize, you have to be able to deal with the political system. You have to understand it. You have to be able to maneuver within it. There's a new term, a recent term that's come up that refers to both civilians and the military. It's called national security professionals. These are people that deal with this problem. So the idea again is that that you have to be able to be political in the sense you understand the system and the like, and that's different from being partisan. That is identifying with one party or the other. The military needs to go out of its way to be non-partisan. Another one here is the combination of civil military relation patterns and service doctrines will affect military effectiveness and strategy. I was very gratified that in policy review not too long ago, it was policy, foreign policy, picked up on my argument, which basically was to say that if you look what some people call the strategy deficit, why have we in the military, has the military had such a difficult time coming to grips with a strategy that is going to be successful? And my argument in that was to say, well, it's a combination of three things. The first is the idea of the preference on the part of the military for the normal theory of civil-military relations. That is, we're autonomous. We get to do what we want. Once the decision is made to go to war, then you guys stand aside, you civilians stand aside, and we will take care of it. The second is the emphasis, especially in the Army, but in the other services as well, on what's called the operational level of war. That's the warfighting level. And obviously, you want to focus on that. But the problem is, Hugh Strahan has called this the politics of a free zone. And the problem is, if you have an operationally competent organization that lacks, strategic focus, then you can drive it over a cliff. And in some respects, that's some of the things that I think we've seen recently. And the third factor was, as I say, an unintended consequence of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which was to weaken the position of the corporate Joint Chiefs of Staff and service chiefs to the benefit of the combatant commanders. And the problem is that was designed primarily to improve strategy, but if, as happened during the Iraq War, the Joint Chiefs are marginalized, then you don't have that input. And so you get back to the idea that that you have to watch all of these factors, not just civilian control, but also things like patterns and military doctrines and so forth. This is something that I think is forgotten, but if you go back and you look at the civil-military disputes that have taken place in the American Republic, it's not usually the civilians versus the military per se. It's factions. It's, you know, one group of military combining one part of the civilians versus another one. And, you know, here's just some examples, and there are plenty more, of course. You know, it is not simply the issue that Douglas MacArthur was fired by President Truman. Truman was basically, you know, kind of pushed in that direction by both Eisenhower and Marshall. On the other hand, MacArthur had support from the Republicans in Congress. I use the other examples here, basically the Marines in the Osprey. I had, you know, got involved in that sort of thing. You know, if it had been the way, if it had been the preference of Dick Cheney's Department of Defense and David Chew and PA&E, the Marine Corps would not have the Osprey. But the Marines are very skillful in terms of working in Congress and so forth, and of course, we got our Osprey, got it, you know, and we're glad we did. But anyway, that's a different issue. And then, of course, you've got these other issues. And one of the problems I foresee is that as the budgets begin to come down, we may see the end of jointness. Maybe not the end, but the fact is that it's easier to be joint when everybody's pretty much getting what they want. Okay, now when the budgets come down and the Army's not going to get everything it wants and the Air Force is not getting everything it wants, then you're going to start to see these let's say pot shots, which, by the way, have already begun. But that's, you know, I think a very important point in all this. Now, the question is, you know, how do we, oh, I've jumped, how do I go back here? Let me go back.
Sure.
Thanks. The other way.
Oh, forward.
I'm sorry. Other way, back.
Okay.
Sorry.
See what happens when you have a general trying to do something here? Where's the NCO who knows everything?
One more. Okay, thank you. You want to take care of it? Anyway.
I'm your aide for the day.
You know, the question is, okay, how do you decide whether civil-military relations are healthy or not? Well, one of the arguments is, okay, you don't have any disagreements, you know, comedy between the two sides and so forth. Well, that may be true, but it also may be the case that you've just hired a bunch of yes men. And that, you know, when the secretary says, is this what we should do, everybody says, sounds like a wonderful idea, Sensei, you know, so we go into that. But of course, it is clear that you're probably more likely, a more likely indication of good civil-military relations is when you do have success in war and peace, and you don't have strategic and policy mismatches. And then finally, a lack of encroachment by either party on the civil-military decisions on the turf of the other. And again, this is, you have to be a little careful of this because given our kind of republic, you know, given the kind of environment in which we find ourselves, the fact is that there is going to be this, you know, this poaching, as we can say, as we go forward here. All right, let's see. There we go. So the question is, okay, you know, what can we say about the future? You know, what can we say is going to influence civil-military relations in the future? And the first is the character of the wars we're going to fight in the future. Okay, we get back to the point I made. Is it going to be continuation of what we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan? Or is it going to be the high-tech standoff kind of wars that people are envisioning against, say, China or other great powers? The danger, of course, with the protracted wars, we saw that, is the idea that, and this is dangerous, I don't see it that much at Newport, but you get hints of it every now and then, is this sort of disdain on the part of the military for a certain extent to the Americans, because what's the old saying? America's not at war, the Marines and the Army at war. Okay, that sort of thing. You heard a lot of that back in the during the Iraq War, And there's something to be said with that, about that. But the problem is that taken too far, you end up with the problem of Praetorianism. And I think those of you who read the Rolling Stone article on General McChrystal, it wasn't that he was going to take his army and cross the Rubicon and seize power in Washington. It was this reporter, which had never been there in the first place, but that's a different issue altogether, reported what amounted to simply disdain on the part of his staff for the civilians in government and so forth. And so, he had the president had no choice but to ask for General McChrystal's resignation, and General McChrystal had no alternative but to give it because of command climate, and I think that's the real problem. The other thing, I already mentioned this, is the idea that with budgets coming down, we might see an end of jointness. Just as importantly, I think, is going to be domestic politics, and there are a couple of things we've already seen here. You probably, we used to talk a lot about the gap, the civil-military gap back in the 1990s. And again, Peter Fever and Dick Cohen did this very intensive study of the gap during that period of time. It could have been overstated at the time, but you can't, at least the participation gate, you cannot you cannot understate it now. You saw the piece in Time where he said, the other 1%. Participation in the military is very low. Most people out there do not know people in the military. There's a tendency, frequently people who go into the military are what? They're military juniors. So, that's problematic. And that leads to a couple of things that, on the one hand, you have just simply ignorance about the military, but at the other hand, you have this idea that the tendency to praise them for whatever they do. And I think both are equally bad. Another thing I think is very important is this idea of what might be called the forgotten aspect of U.S. civil-military relations, and that's how society treats its veterans and its soldiers and vice versa. And I was mentioning to Will, who's going to be your speaker tomorrow, he's from the VA, of course, General Counsel of the VA, that I'm kind of setting him up, give it a little about a discussion, because this next thing I think is very interesting. There's going to be competing debate, there's going to be competing narratives over the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And I'm not talking about people telling lies, but basically how the things how they're portrayed and the like. And there are two interesting precedents in all of this. One is the Democratic Party's loss of Union soldiers after the war because of the actions of the Copperheads during the war. And the other is exactly the same thing that happened after Vietnam. If you ask me why there's so many people self-identified as Republicans in the military these days, it's because of what happened after the Vietnam War, the way the Democratic Party treated the veterans. Opponents of the wars these days are much smarter because they haven't done that. They haven't done this thing that was done back in the late 60s and the 70s. So I think that's one thing it's going to see, sort of the competition of these narratives. This is another thing I think is this idea of what kind of model are we going to use when we look at our returning soldiers. PTSD, and in many respects, that can be called simply a disease model. It looks at this and says, okay, you guys have gone through a terrible traumatic situation, and we're going to treat it as a disease. Now, my friend Jim Mattis, General Mattis, who also has a problem, I'm not saying what's on his mind, was up at Newport just the other day, and he had an alternative. He called it positive traumatic growth. As you go, killing another human being, especially up close, is very traumatic. How do you deal with it? And in some respects, and don't misunderstand this, one of the things American society has to be able to do is to, look their soldiers in the eyes and say, what you did was okay. We're not talking about atrocity, you're not doing this. We sent you to war to kill the enemies of the United States, and you did it. You did a very good job, and now welcome home. And I think that, this is, I'd be interested to see what we'll talk about. He advised me he was going to be gone for my talk today, but I did tell him I was setting up, so I asked him about this tomorrow. A couple of other things, that I would This is a friend of mine. Maybe if some of you have read his novel, Matterhorn. It's about Vietnam. It's not about bobsledding. Okay, Carl and I were in the same Marine Infantry Battalion in Vietnam in 1968, 1969. And this is a bestseller within the last couple of years. But he also wrote a book called What It's Like to Go to War, which I think is one of the best. You should read it, get it, look at it, because it's a very introspective look at these sorts of things. And in view of this, I've really always liked this quote from Parzival, because it captures the division in the soul, or the split in the soul of the soldier. Shame and honor. And I like that last line. But such man may yet make merry, for heaven and hell have equal part in him. And I think that's that's the truth of the soldier coming back from the war, and that has to be recognized by the broader civilian population. Now, there are 4 words that should guide us in thinking about civil-military relations in the future. And there they are. Okay. I think if you look at whether it's with President Obama and General McChrystal and some of the things going on, or going back to, especially Secretary Rumsfeld and the issues here, it was a lack of trust on both sides. And I think that we have to be constantly vigilant to ensure that the military says what they believe very strongly, the civilians listen, and that there's give and take, and then you go from there. But that's, I think, the key to healthy civil-military relations. I think I've left a little time for questions.
Yes, do we have any questions? And I'd ask you, I think our microphones are working better now. Chris?
Yes, sir, thank you for your comments. My question would go back to your words on Goldwater Nichols and whether or not you think there ought to be a change in the role of the service chiefs vis-a-vis the COCOM commanders.
Well, that
just for the benefit of everybody, COCOM commanders is a combatant commander, and it's the way the military organizes itself on an international level, and these are the area commanders. There are some functional, but they're mainly area commanders.
Yeah. I actually wrote a piece one time called 2 Cheers for Goldwater Nichols. And part of my argument was that it did make some necessary changes, but part of that was the unintended consequences. And by trying to strengthen, rightfully so, the role of the combatant commander, the regional commanders and so forth, it basically made the real debates in Washington now among them. Rather than being the executors of war, implementers of policy and so forth, now they get involved intimately in the budget battles, which used to be something that was left simply to the service chiefs. And to a certain extent, that's, I can understand that. The real problem, the other unintended consequence I said here, is that we have to come back to the idea that the service chiefs need to be able to participate in this. The services, Title 10, they have Title 10 responsibility for equipping and training their forces and so forth. And join us will get you only so far. I mean, I'm an advocate of join us, but the fact is you have to understand that we have separate services for a purpose. And I think that we probably weaken the corporate Joint Chiefs of Staffs too much, and those individuals in their role as service chiefs as well, and that there needs to be some rebalancing of that.
Max, since the National Security Act of 1947 brought the military to the table in policy discussions in peacetime, we've been trying to wrestle with this National Security Council. How can it function effectively? Clinton administration had the Presidential Decision Directive 56 for complex contingencies. That was thrown out by the Bush administration. Then the Bush administration had more of an ad hoc approach with defense more on the in the lead, and that didn't work out. So what would you recommend would be the way to codify a system for the tensions to be constructively used? I'm
not sure that it can ever be codified for the simple reason, look, that's what, the National Security Act 1947 did. It said, okay, the president's going to have a National Security Council. But presidents have used them in different ways. I mean, President Eisenhower is very formal. You know, President Kennedy wasn't. He had his own sort of kitchen cabinet that came in and talked about these things. Whatever system we have, you have to have a role for the military. And the military, the two things, gets back to this trust issue. The military has to be confident enough to say, Mr. President, you're really screwed up in making this decision. And you know, you probably know the story about General Marshall, when everybody thought he was going to, the second time everybody thought he was going to be fired, when, you know, basically during a meeting in 1940, something had to do with Lend-Lease, and the president said this, and don't you agree, George, who hated to be called by his first name, and who replied, no, Mr. President, I disagree. Everybody, well, that's it for George. They have to be like that. They have to be Marshall-like in the sense they'll make their argument, but also like Marshall, then do what essentially what they're directed to do. The flip side is the civilians have to be open to military advice. I'm not sure we like to move boxes around. We like to organize, say, oh, if this isn't working, we'll organize it this way. In some respects, that's what Goldwater Nichols was. And, you know, we haven't had unmitigated successes ever since. I mean, we've had our set of problems. So I think, though, that the key is that both sides know what their roles are and that they carry them out. And I'm not sure there's any particular codification we can use to get to that.
Hello.
Dan?
You say that trust is the most important thing moving forward. What's your evaluation of the trust right now between the president and the military?
That's interesting. I think that I think it was probably the low point a couple of years ago. I think it may be improved now. The people, is Tom here? Okay, yeah. Maybe you'll talk about that. I mean, the fact is that the reason I said it because he's right there. Okay, I'm up in Newport. I get to look at it over Narragansett Bay. You know, okay, I get to think great thoughts and so forth, and I actually have to execute anything. But the fact is that my assessment is just based on, you know, what I've heard is that you probably hit a low point during that period of time. Afghanistan, where the military thought that the president was trying to hang them out to dry with failure, and the president and his advisors thought the military was trying to box them into a particular approach. I think my impression is things have improved. That doesn't mean that you know, everything's hunky-dory. I think they're still, you know, they're rarely circling each other to a certain extent. But at least it seems to me it's in the right direction. Tom?
I hope this
the guy
is on.
who actually practiced.
Well, yeah, let me comment about that a little bit. And again, this is all off the record, but I don't know. I can't get this thing to work ever. But are we going now? All right. So what?
You don't want to be taped anyway, but go ahead.
One of the things that happened with the Obama administration was that, and I was involved in the Obama defense campaign for full disclosure. There was a lot of inexperience in the initial part of the Obama administration, or the Obama political campaign going in, and they found that going in and governing and campaigning were two radically different things. And what they were able to do because of Secretary Gates was basically to outsource military issues to Secretary Gates and his Pentagon. And what that did was that gave a lot of the initiative in defense planning to the military inside the Pentagon. And I think what you've seen with the way that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq evolved, that has gradually been reeled back in by the Obama administration and his national security staff. They've sort of slowly brought things back into their realm where I believe it should be. And so you're seeing a lot more of, I would say, civil-military balance now than there was before. And what you see is civilians, and this is a good thing, civilians willing to question and kind of challenge the military, and in this case, primarily the Army's approach to how we fight, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and especially the idea that every problem solution is more troops and more time. This is being challenged now, right, by this group. And I think, so I actually think we're sort of back into a much better balance than we were before.
Mac, thank you very much. I got to hand it to you. You have covered a really wide spectrum of issues related to civil-military relations, and there's nobody better than you. Sorry, Peter. Thank you so much. And Mac's going to be around, so if you have other issues you want to bring up with him, I'm sure he'll entertain that discussion. Oops. Here we go. We're going to go on break now for 15 minutes, and then on order, we're going to come back here at 1:30 and have our next panel.
Very much, my friend.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.